Ian, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your chapter?
Well, um, I'm Ian Gordon, a little croaky
No.
today. Um, my chapter, I have lived and worked in Singapore for a good number of years now. I'm a historian by training, but almost all my work has been on media history um, of the United States, a little bit on Australia as well. So in this chapter, I'm really looking at the way that Rose O'Neill used a particular set of visual tropes and gave form in cartoons to those. Most of these tropes almost certainly originated in minstrelsy and found their shape in magazines like Puck and in others like Judge and Life. And what I'm looking at in them primarily is the way that she circulated these. These were not the prime aspect of her work. Most of her work, the great majority of it, was on other areas, domestic humor, relationships between men and women primarily. And even in these cartoons of hers that featured African Americans and were, not to put too fine a point on it, racist cartoons, a lot of those too focused on domestic relations. And the prime way she addressed this in her cartooning was to use this very familiar figure from minstrelsy of the lazy African American man and make a lot of jokes around that. And I came to this because I'd seen somebody else writing about this, and I thought their take, instinctively, I thought their take was wrong. And I thought they were downplaying and perhaps misunderstanding the way that this trope was being used. And so I decided that, I want to address this, and the best way to address this is to go and look at all of Rose O'Neill's cartoons and in Puck. And so I did. The thing about O'Neill that makes Rose O'Neill special is she was probably the first published woman cartoonist in America, or at least in a major publication. She was a full-time cartoonist for Puck at the turn of the 20th century, which is something phenomenal. And she was the one woman amongst an array of men. And that she was one of their most important cartoonists, not just one of their best, but one of the most regular contributors. And sometimes in an issue, she would have 3 or 4 cartoons, and some other folks would only have one. So she was a really important figure. And of course, most people would know of her from the Cupies, which is somewhat later in her career. And not much has been written about this early part. So I thought, looking at this and looking at the way it was just kind of commonplace for cartoonists to use these racial tropes, and O'Neill did it. This is an anti-lynching cartoon, and when you first look at it, or when I first look at it, I think when most people first look at it, you kind of look at it and go, okay, what's going on? And it's like, well, something's happening, and the figures are all, drawn in stereotypical fashion. And you might just kind of skip over it. When you read the caption at the bottom, the joke, and there is a joke here, is that African Americans were safer under slavery because they had more value. And when you read that, you're like, well, why? What's going on? And you have to look, and thank you for blowing this up in the top left-hand corner of the image, and then you realize an African American man is being taken away probably by armed people, probably to be lynched, because this is at the time, and the caption is in Georgia, and this is at a time when there was a great outrage about the enormous number of lynchings taking place in Georgia, which were getting attention. It's plugging into particular ways of representation, and a joke that really dehumanizes African Americans, even as it's being anti-lynching.
So I'm Andy Kunka, and my chapter is on, as you said, Will Eisner and Ebony White, and it's titled "How Else Could I Have Created a Black Boy in That Era? Racial Caricature and Will Eisner's Legacy." And I've got a lot of comments about that title, about that quote that's in the title, but I think that kind of gets at the heart of what I was looking at in that chapter. But I like the pairing here with Ian's chapter, because I think we're both dealing with creators who are considered kind of sacred and innovative for what they did, and Eisner for his various innovations as a businessman, as a studio owner, and as a creator who is bringing cinematic qualities and other new innovations to the art and narrative of comics. And Rose O'Neill with her voting rights activism, and just her groundbreaking role as Ian laid out as a woman at Puck, and that there seems to be an impulse then to for fans of these creators to try to make them like completely acceptable and on everything that they did, or that if they're going to be innovative in one particular area, well, they had to have been innovative in other areas, so let's try to kind of twist what they did that looks problematic into something that is actually pushing boundaries or challenging these tropes. So I think that's when Ian talks about reading that the other scholarship about Rose O'Neill, and how it tries to make Rose O'Neill also not just an innovator or an activist and on the right side of voting rights, but put her on the right side of civil rights too. And that just doesn't work when you look very carefully at the work as a whole. And that's the same thing that goes on with Will Eisner. So what I did was kind of wanting to look at the afterlife of Ebony White, how Ebony White as a character was talked about, because after The Spirit came out, because and had ended in 1952, because so many because one of the things about Will Eisner's work is that it has pretty much remained in print for more than 80 years at this point, and so every time it comes back into a print, or a new project comes up to reprint Spirit stories, especially, they get the subject of Ebony White comes up. And Eisner himself lived a long time, and he lived long enough to kind of see these criticisms of Ebony White aimed directly at him. So I wanted to look at and see how the discourse of it on Ebony White developed over time, from the original appearances through the reprints and other appearances as well. So and one of the things that Eisner did to defend himself was, as it says in the title, to claim that he was kind of powerless in the face of the zeitgeist, that if you were looking at popular culture at the time, and he cites, for example, like Amos and Andy a lot, if you're looking at popular culture at the time, this was the only way to do this, when first of all, that is absolutely not true. And then second, that you know, in terms of kind of what the effect of having a character like this or creation like this in his legacy, that that Eisner tried to finesse his work on the Spirit to show that he was actually very progressive at a time, that whatever kind of problems there were with Ebony might have been there at the beginning. They were definitely exaggerated when other people took over the Spirit while Eisner was drafted. People like Manly Wade Wellman and Lou Fine and so on. And that that when he came back, he had been exposed to, came back from the war, he had been exposed to other, you know, exposed to African American soldiers and their lives, and decided to humanize Ebony based on that experience, and to introduce new characters that were more positive, you know, consciously positive and so on. And yet, you know, in looking at the series and as a whole and reading through it, that just doesn't seem to be, you know, that just doesn't seem to be the case. At one point in a story called As Ever Orange, where Ebony tries to romance this young woman named As Ever, and she rejects him because he talks like a minstrel. She literally says that. And so he decides to ask the Spirit if he can be sent off to school so he can get, as it says, educated, so he can speak with a northern drawl. And so Ebony leaves the series for a little bit, and that's another thing that gets exaggerated, that he left for a long time, but he leaves for about 3 months, and comes back. And again, another comment that gets made by other writers about the Spirit is that he comes back significantly changed, that his speech pattern is less egregious, and the way he's drawn is you know, limited as well. But that just, I mean, I can't find any evidence that was the case. There's a couple strips when he comes back where he has laryngitis and can't talk, which is kind of telling. But other than that, he doesn't seem dramatically changed, and that's always a thing that I've, you know, if Eisner was really committed to changing Ebony in a progressive way, he could have had him leave and brought him back and drew him completely different, and, you know, gave him different speech patterns and so on. And he doesn't do that.